Now, I'm sure by now you've heard of the economic crisis which is unfolding in real time in China right now. Now, what I want to do in this video is give you the exact timeline of how this came to be. I want to explain to you exactly what is going on, and more importantly, I want to answer the question of, is it going to affect the rest of the world? Is it going to affect the West? Is it going to affect the United States? And more importantly, is it going to affect you? So this video is going to be a little bit different. I have a list of bullet points because this is a complex situation and there are a lot of moving parts, and I want to give you exactly how it started and the exact timeline of how we got to where we are today. So I'm going to be looking at my computer and I'm going to be going over bullet point by bullet point, explaining to you exactly what happened and giving you my perspectives. At the end, we will answer the question of whether you need to be worried about this or not. So, as always, my name is Derek and I got my degree in finance, so you don't have to. Let's piece together the 2023 Chinese economy crisis. Now, this took place, or this started, all the way back in 1999, early 2000s. Even back then, China had its sights set on becoming a world superpower and a global leader. So what it did is it allowed college to become more accessible to basically anyone who wanted to go to college. So it made admissions easier and it made college more accessible to the population. Now, if you are a young, brand new student and you just got your degree and you want to make money, where are you going to go? You're going to move to the city, which is exactly what happened. You had an influx of people, young, educated people, moving to the city. The reason this happened in the first place is because China understood that it needed to be a knowledge-based economy if it was going to compete with the world. So, students start moving to cities after they became college educated. Now, this is where the real estate portion of this whole mess comes into play. Evergrande and Country Garden and many others, but we're gonna focus on these two because they're the ones that are in the spotlight and they're kind of the ones that are leading the charge into doom for the Chinese economy. So Evergrande, Country Garden, and many others saw an opportunity to make money because you have people influxing into city centers and you do not have enough housing. So what did they start to do? They started to build massively in cities to make up supply for this demand. And they started to do that by borrowing a ton of money. And when I mean a ton of money, I mean a ton of money and I mean unrestricted. There was basically no limitation to them being able to borrow. So if they had a project to fund, they could borrow it, basically unhindered by the government. So you have extreme supply growth in city centers. Now, this is fine as long as the economy keeps growing, which from basically the early 2000s until 2020, the Chinese economy was a rocket ship. It was unbelievable how fast the Chinese economy grew. Now, with economic growth comes what? Real estate prices increase, which is also good for companies like Evergrande and Country Garden because they need their assets to increase, right, in order to make profit. Now, this is all fine and good all up until 2020. Okay, this came to a screeching halt in 2020, and it wasn't precisely because of the pandemic, although the pandemic did have an effect. All right, so in 2020, ignoring the pandemic, the Chinese government basically came up with two new policies or policy shifts. Basically, they started to see these real estate prices go crazy, and they started to see the amount of debt that these companies were undertaking, and they also started to see that the people who were buying these homes may not have been the most qualified people. So looking back at 2008 and what happened in the US economy, that was probably influence as to these two policy shifts in 2020. The first one is known as the 3 red lines. The second one is your standard mortgage qualifications. The mortgage qualifications is easier to understand. They just raise the bar for who could borrow in order to purchase a house. The 3 red lines is interesting though. This is basically 3 limitations on when a company like Evergrande can borrow money. The first is debt to assets. The second is debt to cash. And the third is debt to equity. Pretty standard stuff, but until then, they didn't really exist, and Evergrande and Country Gardens were allowed to borrow unrestricted. The problem is, when these things came into play in 2020, Evergrande was basically already past the threshold on each one of these limitations. So because it had borrowed so much, it was already way past the threshold, which means that in an instant, Evergrande's funding basically came to a halt. Not only that, but on top of all that, right, you have demand that is about to fall off a cliff because the government made it harder to borrow money. So what happens when you have supply that's been going crazy straight up for the last 10 years? So you have oversupply, and then demand is barely keeping up. And then all of a sudden 2020 comes and the government says no more funding for growth, and basically your demand, the people who are going to buy Evergrande's buildings, apartments, now you have to qualify at a much higher level. So when you have more demand than supply, prices rise. When you have more supply than demand, prices fall. Not only that, but the pandemic did have an effect, and it had an effect here. People pulled back on spending. Okay, so when people pull back on spending, there's again less money going around in the economy, which again pulls back demand. Now, on top of all of that, because of the pandemic, the younger generation, which is the generation that as generations get older, the younger generation is supposed to push forward housing prices, right? The younger generation comes in and moves the housing prices higher, and then so forth and so forth. That younger generation, it's estimated, has a currently a 20+% unemployment rate, which might actually be more like 40% if you take into account the people who have stopped looking for jobs. So you have Evergrande, who on their balance sheet has a ton of supply of houses, okay? And they have been continuing to fund their growth with funding that immediately stopped. Now you have all these vacant units and you have people who can no longer buy them. So your demand fell off a cliff because the Chinese government decided to make mortgages harder to acquire. Plus you have an unforeseen pandemic which wreaked havoc on people's abilities to make money in the first place. So all this put together put a huge amount of strain on Evergrande, on Country Gardens, and on many other real estate developers. But we're going to focus on Evergrande right now because 1 year later, 2021, Evergrande defaulted on its debt. And between 2021 and now, basically, Evergrande has been trying to regain its footing, has been scrambling to try to regain its footing and to become a profitable company again. It was unable to do that. And in 2023, this year, about a week ago, Evergrande filed for bankruptcy in the United States, Chapter 15 bankruptcy protection. Now, the problem with this is already a huge company. Its founder, the second richest person in China for a long time. They filed for bankruptcy last week. Okay, now the news starts to cover it and everyone starts to look at what's going on in China. That's why you're hearing about this right now. The problem is the next thing under the microscope is Country Garden, because Country Garden is basically Evergrande in 2021. That's happening right now. The thing is, Country Garden is 4 times the size of Evergrande. Its owner was at one point the richest person in China. The thing is, this company has 1 month, less than 1 month, to pay on its debt that it already technically defaulted on. It has a grace period. We're not sure if that's September 5th or September 6th. The point is, you have a company that is looking like it is following in Evergrande's footsteps, that is going to most likely default on September 5th or 6th. And if the trajectory continues, that means in the next year or two, maybe filing for bankruptcy. The only problem is this company is 4 times the size of Evergrande, and that already had repercussions through the Chinese economy. Now, the reason why it had such massive repercussions through the Chinese economy and why people are so worried about Country Garden is because you have to understand that when we think about China, we think about their economy being based on labor and production of goods. But the fact of the matter is 30%. 1/3 of the Chinese economy is in some shape, way, or form tied to real estate. That means 1 in every $3 in China is tied to real estate. Here's the more scary thing. Chinese wealth, that means Chinese citizens hold their wealth twice as much as the United States in real estate. In the United States, about 30 to 35% of all wealth in this country is held in real estate assets. In China, it is 70%. So you have more than 2/3 of everyone's wealth tied into a real estate market. You have 30% of every GDP dollar coming from a real estate market, and you have a crash in that market that looks imminent. So for China, this is really bad news because a huge portion of their wealth is tied to something that looks like it is falling apart. That is why this whole thing is all over the news, and that is why China, Evergrande, Country Garden, they've all scrambled to try to find a solution. Now, China has underplayed it. They've underplayed their unemployment, and they've underplayed this whole thing because that's what they do. But the fact of the matter is, this is severe, and it is probably unprecedented when it comes to the Chinese economy because for the last 20 years, all we have seen from China is a powerhouse in economic growth. So, I guess the more important question, will this affect the rest of the world? Will it affect you? Well, it kind of depends. It is kind of like an earthquake. The closer to the epicenter, the more damage that you are going to feel. So Asian countries are most likely going to feel it the most. First and foremost, China. If the real estate market crashes, if they cannot get a hold of this and they cannot prop up real estate prices, they're going to have a bad time in China. And wealth is going to be destroyed in China massively. Chinese neighbors, so Asian countries who are closely related to China, and closely, when I say related, I mean economically related, tied into China's economics. Those countries are going to feel it the next most. As you move further away, Europe, probably not. And then as you move to the United States, I would almost say, I don't have a magic 8-ball, all right, but I would almost say most certainly not. And that is because the West, the further west you move in economics, the less exposure there is to China's direct economy, and more importantly, to China's real estate economy. Less than 1% of US GDP, all right, which is trillions upon trillions of dollars, less than 1% has direct exposure to Chinese real estate. So that's the good news. The bad news is that, remember, China, most of its wealth is kept in real estate, and a huge portion of its economy is based in real estate. If that implodes, there's going to be ripples and repercussions through the rest of China's economy, all right? And that can affect the rest of the world because we get a lot of our production from China. We get a lot of our goods from China, and we are reliant, whether we like it or not, on Chinese labor for many, many things, even the United States. So I guess everyone's fear is that this contagion is spread throughout the rest of the Chinese economy. That's the major problem, and that could affect the United States. I don't think it would affect it tomorrow or the next day or even next year. Remember, when you're talking about macroeconomic things, they take a long time to come to fruition, and you see that with Evergrande that defaulted in 2021 and didn't file bankruptcy until 2 years later, a week ago. So it will take time. We don't know yet what's going to happen. All this is speculation because we don't even know if Country Garden is going to default. It looks like it is. It looks imminent. They have a grace. Technically, they already defaulted. Technically, they didn't pay, but they have a grace period, like you and I, 30 days before it is a true default. We're not sure. They didn't really tell us if it is September 5th or September 6th or September 4th or September 7th, but people are pretty sure it's one of those 2 days, September 5th or September 6th. The government has also stated that it is not planning on bailing anybody out. All right, and all the government has done is kind of cut interest rates a little bit. Will that hold as it approaches the deadline? I don't know. Evergrande was considered too big to fail. It did fail. Now, is Country Garden too big to fail? The only people who know that are the people in the Chinese government because they are the only people who can answer the question of whether they want to take that risk or not. They can either bail them out or they can let it fail and have either one has repercussions, as we've seen in our own economy. When you bail out things like in 2008, when you bail out banks, you have to print money to do so, and that has major implications as well. So we will see what happens. I hope this video was informative because there's been a lot of information about what is happening, but it's a very complex and very tricky situation. So I hope that this kind of, I guess, kind of gave you the timeline, because this has been developing for basically 20 years. It started as a good thing. The economic boom happened for the last 20 years, and then you can blame the pandemic, or you can blame China's own government for misjudging the right course of action. They tried to stop a real estate bubble, and instead they created a debt crisis. So we'll see how this plays out. It is interesting to see that it is basically China's fault that this is happening, and it also highlights the weaknesses in the Chinese economy, because the Chinese economy is touted as this powerhouse, and it is a powerhouse, but it is not as invincible as I think most people think. And just like any other economy, it can fail, and it can also have periods of negative growth, which it's not there yet, but it very much could get there. So I hope this video was informative. I hope I gave you a good breakdown of exactly what happened in a good order. As always, my name is Derek, and I got my degree in finance. You don't have to. I love this stuff. I love personal finance. I love economics. I love investing, and I love being able to share it with you guys. I've been doing this for over a decade. It's been my passion for over a decade, and I love being able to share that with you guys. So if you like personal finance, if you like investing, if you like economics, if you like world topics like this broken down and just discussed, you're in the right place. So please feel free to subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on the bell notification. It helps the channel immensely, and it'll allow you not to miss the next video. Videos are usually on Tuesdays here, but when something like this happens, we'll usually do a video Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday. Again, my name is Derek. I love you guys, and I will see you in the next video.